Okay, we are starting chapter 23, which is the urinary system. In this first video, we're going to get through the functions of the urinary system and anatomy of the kidney. And in the second video, we'll get through urine formation. And then the last video, we'll get into the component of urine, renal function, test, storage, and elimination. Okay, so this is basically giving you an introduction to the urinary system, which is something that most people are familiar with. So this really makes students, it's really most interesting for most students because, like I said, you get the big picture. It's the principal means of waste removal. So urinary system is getting rid of waste in the body. This saying, Dr. Saladin, the textbook author, uses to live is to metabolize. And you guys know from 103 and 201 that metabolism creates waste products, and a lot of those waste products are toxic to the body. Therefore, they have to be removed from the body. Now, there are actually 4 body systems that work together to remove all of these waste products. Respiratory, which we discussed, digestive, which we will get into in the next chapter, sweat glands, which you talked about in 201, and then, of course, urinary. Now, the kidney. The kidney is the big organ in this system. And here is a list of things that the kidney does. And the first thing, a lot of students sort of go, a little bit question this first function, which is regulating blood volume and blood pressure. Okay, so going back to cardiovascular system, we learned that the blood delivers oxygen to all the tissues. While it's delivering that oxygen, it's also taking up waste products and CO2. All right, so once that blood takes up those waste products, it has to be sent to the kidneys to filter out the waste products so that we're not sending toxic waste products to the heart. Okay, so the kidney has a big job in that filtration, which determines blood volume and blood pressure. Depending on how much filtrate and how much fluid comes out of the blood determines volume and pressure. Also, erythrocyte count. Erythropoietin, which is the hormone that stimulates red blood cell production, comes from the kidney. Blood gases, of course, CO2 and oxygen. Blood pH. Again, we're altering the chemistry of the blood when we take all the filtrate out and return good stuff back in. Because basically the kidney has to filter. It has to decide what's good, what needs to go back into the bloodstream, and what's bad, what do we need to totally eliminate from the body. And then electrolyte and acid-base balance. And by electrolytes, we're talking about salts, potassium, and chlorine. And we're going to talk about those a lot in this chapter and how important they are because they're the main salts in the blood, and we have to regulate that balance. You guys know too much salt in the body is a bad thing. And we have to make sure we have enough potassium. We can't eliminate too potassium because then we'll get into that potassium deficit. And then acid-base balance. When you take these electrolytes out of the blood, you're altering that acid-base balance. Here are the 6 organs of the urinary system. Of course, you have 2 kidneys. You have 2 ureters, which are the tubes that connect the kidney to the bladder. Of course, you have the bladder, which stores urine, expands and contracts daily, all day. And then you have the urethra. And, of course, the urine leaves the body through that urethra. And here's a great image of the urinary system. It shows you an anterior and a posterior view. It shows you the 6 organs. Of course, you have your 2 kidneys here. You have your ureters, 2 of those from each kidney leading down to the bladder. And then finally, you have the urethra. Here's the kidney location. The kidney is actually against the posterior wall. It's actually toward your back. And those of you that have ever had a kidney infection, you know that's where you feel that pain is in your lower back. Okay. So here we're going to go into really detail about what the functions of the kidney are. Obviously, the first one's the easy one, the one you probably know most of your life. It filters blood plasma, separates waste product from useful chemicals. It returns the useful stuff to the blood, and we eliminate the waste. And that's the principal function of the kidney in the urinary system. Of course, it also regulates blood volume and pressure by eliminating or conserving water. Water is a big component of blood, so kidneys are responsible for removing water and putting it back in to prevent the body from having too much water. Also, of course, preventing the body from dehydrating. Regulates the osmolarity of the body fluids by controlling the amounts of water and solutes eliminated. The kidney has to be careful and make sure that we're not getting rid of too much good stuff. Secretes an enzyme called renin. Renin activates hormonal mechanisms that control electrolyte balance and blood pressure. Of course, it secretes the hormone erythropoietin, and that erythropoietin stimulates red blood cell production. It collaborates with the lungs to regulate the CO2 partial pressure and the acid base of body fluids, which of course is that pH. And again, main thing that determines that pH and that gas volume is of course carbon dioxide. It's the final step in synthesizing calcitriol. Now, calcitriol is a hormone that contributes to calcium homeostasis. The first step we talked about back in 201 with the skin and that synthesis. And then finally, it generates glucose. This is called gluconeogenesis. Now, this is not a desirable function of the kidney. This only happens in extreme starvation. Once the digestive system has used all the glucose that it has stored, the kidney can actually make glucose from its amino acids. Again, that is not a normal function of the kidney. That only happens in extreme cases. Okay, so let's talk about waste products for a minute. A waste is, of course, anything that's useless to the body. And if it is presented in excess, then it could actually hurt and harm the body. These are the big three waste. The first one is urea formation. And this goes through how urea is actually formed. Urea is the most abundant waste in the blood. So this is the biggest waste that the kidney and the urinary system is concerned with getting out of the blood. First of all, it's basically the breakdown of proteins. Proteins break down to amino acids, break down to NH2, which is removed, which forms ammonia, which gives urine the smell, the odor. And then, of course, the liver converts that ammonia into urea. And then urea is what's actually excreted in the urine. The second one is uric acid. This is a product of nucleic acid catabolism. Catabolism is the breaking down of nucleic acid. And you guys know, with any chemical reaction, you're going to have a byproduct. And then finally, creatinine, which you studied in 201 during muscle contraction. This is the product of that creatine phosphate catabolism, which of course is breaking down this phosphate to release energy for muscle contraction. We have a measurement called the BUN, which is the blood urea nitrogen. This is the expression of the level of nitrogenous waste in the blood. Okay, here are your big four nitrogenous waste in this picture here: ammonia, urea, creatinine, and uric acid. And we actually, when you get blood work done, they can take your BUN level and measure how much nitrogenous waste is in the blood. If you do have an elevated level, it's called azotemia. This indicates some type of renal insufficiency. Apparently, the kidneys are not filtering out enough of the waste products, and it's being left in the blood, which would, kind of throw up some alarms and red flags as to something's happening in the kidney. And then uremia, which is a syndrome of diarrhea, vomiting, even cardiac arrhythmia, and this stems from the toxicity of nitrogenous waste. And most of the time, if you have this condition, you either have to go on dialysis or an organ transplant, and that's when the kidney is just simply not filtering out that nitrogenous waste. It's staying in the blood, which is becoming toxic to the body. Okay, so let's talk about excretion. This is, of course, separating of waste from the body and then eliminating them. We talked earlier, there are four body systems that carry out that excretion: respiratory, integumentary, digestive, and urinary. Respiratory is mainly concerned with getting CO2 out, other gases and water, but mainly excreting CO2. Of course, that's us breathing it out. Integumentary system: water, salts, lactic acid, even the urea is in sweat. Digestive system, of course, metabolic waste, food residue, water, salts, lipids, bile, cholesterol. And then the urinary system, many metabolic waste, as we just looked at the big four types earlier: toxins, drugs, salts, water, hormone. So it's really important that you're familiar with the four systems and also what they're responsible for excreting from the body. This is going through the anatomy of the kidney, the position and weight and size. It's, again, lies up against the posterior abdominal wall. lower back region from T12 to L3. The right kidney is a little bit lower because the right side of the liver is so large, so it kind of pushes it down a little bit. They are retroperitoneal, which means they face inward. You have one on each side with the ureters and the bladder. They each have a renal artery and a renal vein, and of course adrenal glands that sit on top of them. They're about the size of a bar of bath soap. The lateral surface is convex. The medial is concave. There is a slit on the concave surface called the hilum. This is where the renal arteries and veins, the lymphatic vessels, nerves, and the ureters enter and leave the kidney. And it's really easy to see in just a second. Of course, we have protective tissue coverings. Renal fascia binds it to the wall, abdominal wall. The perirenal fat capsule cushions it and holds it in place. And the fibrous capsule encloses it and protects it from infection and trauma. And here's a good gross anatomy picture of the kidney. Now, anatomy as far as the inside, we have renal parenchyma, which is tissue that basically forms urine. This tissue encircles the renal sinus. Now, in the renal sinus, you have blood, vessels, nerves, and any urine collecting structure. And so I'm going to go through this, and like I did in class, here are the two zones of the tissue in the kidney. You have the renal cortex, which is the outer layer, the outer like 1 centimeter thick, and then you have the inner renal medulla. Okay, now the cortex is simple. It's just the outer centimeter of the kidney. The medulla, there's several parts to it. You have columns and pyramids. The columns are extensions of the cortex that go inward toward the sinus, and they're in between each pyramid. The renal pyramids are the triangular shaped pieces of tissue, and they face the papilla, and the papilla is facing the sinus. It's a layer of tissue that faces the sinus. The lobe of the kidney is one pyramid and its overlying cortex, and I'll show you that in just a second. You have a minor calyx and major calyxes. Minor calyx are the cups that collect urine, and then the major calyxes are when two or three minor calyx converge. When the major calyces converge, they form the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis drains or forms into the ureter, which of course drains the kidney and sends urine down to the bladder. Now, I know that might have been confusing me saying it, so I'm going to show you in this picture because this is a lot easier. Okay, so fibrous capsule, of course, is that outer layer we discussed in the previous 2 slides. Here's the cortex. It's this outer 1 centimeter. Okay, and then from here, these blood vessels into here is called the renal medulla. So it's the center part. Okay, now these triangular shaped things here, they're like fans. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Those are the renal pyramids. Okay, that's the renal pyramid. These things in between them, the columns, these are the renal columns. Notice it's an extension of the cortex that dips down inside each of the pyramids. Okay, now here is the renal sinus right here, and then this area right here, that boundary is going to be the papilla. All right, so here's the papilla, here's the sinus. There's the papilla, there's a sinus. All right, notice the sinus has arteries and veins in it. There's also lymphatic vessels there as well. Okay, all right, now here is a minor calyx. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Those are the minor calyx. 1, see how all 3 of those converge into one? This is a major calyx. And 1, 2, 3, all 3 of those converge into another major calyx. Okay? Then the 2 major calyces form into the pelvis. Right here is the renal pelvis. And then, of course, down this tube is the ureter. Okay, of course it shows you the renal blood vessels, and all of these parts are labeled, but I just really like to make sure I go through that with you because it makes it a lot easier to understand the rest of this if you understand the anatomy of the kidney. Okay, we're going to pause here and we'll pick up and finish this in the next video.